Can one fighter tilt the UFC's entire global expansion strategy? Dricus du Plessis might be that fighter. On August 16, 2025, at UFC 319 in the United Center, Chicago, he defends his middleweight title against Khamzat Chimaev. A win, he says, will have him pushing Dana White immediately to lock in UFC Africa, something he's already promised to pursue as soon as this fight is over. But standing in the way are Chimaev's unpredictable schedule, rival promotions already entering Africa, and the UFC's negotiations for new, potentially billion-dollar broadcast rights, which is why this title defense carries bigger stakes than just the belt. UFC 319 isn't just a title fight, it's a contest that could subtly shift the company's next big move on the world stage. On August 16, 2025, at Chicago's United Center, Dricus du Plessis will defend his middleweight belt against Khamzat Chimaev. For most viewers, this is a matchup of elite fighters. Inside UFC headquarters, it's tied to billion-dollar broadcast negotiations, a race with rival promotions, and the potential launch into one of MMA's last major untapped regions, Africa. That race already has a frontrunner. On July 18th, the Professional Fighters League staged an event in Cape Town, marking the first time a global MMA promotion hosted a live card on African soil. The PFL wasn't chasing huge ticket revenue, they were planting a flag, proving they could operate successfully there, before the UFC. Every month without a UFC event on the continent buys competitors time to sign local fighters, secure broadcast deals, and shape how fans perceive high-level MMA in Africa. The UFC has signaled it doesn't want to wait too long. Dave Shaw, the organization's executive vice president of international and content, said after du Plessis's UFC 305 title defense that UFC Africa is definitely a 2025 thing. But his comments also came with caveats. Multiple countries are lobbying to host, and practical issues like time zone differences could impact pay-per-view timing and viewership, especially in the UK market. For the UFC, the debut can't just happen. It has to be staged in a way that maximizes impact from day one. Here's where the timing feels like a high-stakes bid. In any takeover, when you move matters almost as much as how much you offer. The same dynamic plays out here. Du Plessis, as the first South African to win a UFC title, gives the promotion something no other fighter can, a direct connection to the market they're trying to enter. That's valuable currency when convincing governments, broadcasters, and corporate sponsors that the event will succeed. A victory over Chimaev would give UFC Africa a stronger promotional anchor. It wouldn't automatically lock in the event, but it would materially improve the UFC's position at the negotiating table, making it easier to justify higher rights fees, attract larger sponsorship deals, and assure officials they're backing an event with a proven homegrown draw. Lose that advantage, and the UFC faces tougher questions about how to generate the same momentum without a champion headliner from the continent. For du Plessis, this isn't just about retaining his belt, it's about holding a rare form of leverage. The result in Chicago could shape not only his career path, but also the UFC's confidence in accelerating its plans for Africa. And that kind of influence, using athletic success to influence corporate direction, sets the stage for an even bigger question: what happens when a fighter becomes a market maker? Turning athletic dominance into corporate influence requires more than just winning fights. It demands consistent results, a proven ability to move markets, and a clear vision for what comes next. Dricus du Plessis has managed exactly that, and the foundation for his leverage was laid well before UFC 319 was even on the calendar. His climb wasn't a sudden breakthrough. From making a statement at UFC 290 to breaking into the middleweight title picture, he built momentum. By the time he stepped in to defend his belt at UFC 312 against Sean Strickland, he wasn't just another champion. He was a proven draw with the financial receipts to back it up. Media estimates put du Plessis' total payout at UFC 312 in the low seven figures. Some outlets reported about $3.34 million, but public reporting differs on how much of that came from base salary, pay-per-view points, and bonuses. Regardless of the breakdown, the number placed him squarely among the top earners in the promotion. That level of payday isn't only a reward for past success, it's a signal to the UFC that he can sell tickets, move pay-per-views, and bring in sponsorship value. Those last two are especially powerful in an era where the company is eyeing billion-per-year global broadcast deals. Many UFC fighters earn in the five-figure range on reported fight payouts, even on major cards. At UFC 312, for example, several athletes took home between $24,000. The contrast is stark. That gap in earnings is more than a disparity of income. It's a reflection of who can draw significant audiences. And in the UFC, drawing audiences isn't just prestige, it's negotiating power. When a fighter can prove they directly boost pay-per-view buys and streaming reach, that becomes a bargaining chip, not just with the UFC, but with potential rights holders and local broadcasters in new markets. For du Plessis, his influence goes beyond numbers. As South Africa's first UFC champion, he's tapped into a groundswell of national pride. He's not only being cheered in arenas, he's in active talks with South African sports ministers, city officials, and arena executives about bringing a UFC event to the country. By connecting UFC leadership directly with local decision makers, he's shortening the distance between an ambitious idea and a viable business plan. That's a level of initiative most fighters never take on, and it strengthens his case that UFC Africa could launch with him at the center. Combine consistent winning, proven market pull and the ability to rally both fans and officials, and you have more than a belt holder. You have someone who can influence where the UFC invests next. But holding that influence depends entirely on staying champion. And in Chicago, the man challenging for his title brings risks that have little to do with the fight itself. What happens when the opponent in a title fight is himself a variable the UFC can't fully control? That's the question with Khamzat Chimaev. He's an undefeated phenomenon with a fan base stretching from Europe to the Middle East, and few fighters generate online engagement like he does. His weigh-ins trend worldwide, his aggressive style grabs headlines, and his name alone can spike interest on a card. But Chimaev draws huge engagement with an asterisk. His career has been marked by disruptions tied to health issues, scheduling complications, and political associations that make long-term planning risky. One example still stands out. At UFC 279, he missed weight by 7.5 pounds for his scheduled fight with Nate Diaz, forcing the UFC to reshuffle the main card hours before the event. Add to that earlier bouts scrapped due to severe COVID-19 complications and visa delays. Multiple outlets reported he required high-level intervention just to secure his UFC 319 spot, and you have a star whose availability is never guaranteed. The hype is real, but so is the uncertainty. That uncertainty matters here because the shape of UFC Africa changes depending on who leaves Chicago with the belt. If Chimaev wins, the UFC could still debut on the continent, but the initial pitch to governments, broadcasters, and sponsors would no longer center on a local champion. Instead of showcasing a South African holding UFC gold, they'd be selling a global star whose story points elsewhere. For short-term ticket sales, that might work. For building the perception of Africa as a long-term market, it complicates the narrative. It also opens another strategic question. Chimaev has spoken publicly about fighting across divisions, from welterweight all the way to potentially light heavyweight. If he captures the middleweight title, the UFC may prioritize capitalizing on blockbuster cross-division fights, or staging events in regions tied more closely to his heritage and fan base. That doesn't just change the promotional focus, it risks pushing Africa down the schedule in favor of markets that deliver faster returns. From a business perspective, there's logic in such a move. Entering a new continent requires months of negotiations over venue deals, broadcast rights, and sponsor alignments. If the champion has no direct ties to that market, the perceived return on that investment could diminish. A Chimaev win would complicate the UFC's pitch for an Africa debut with a local champion and could delay or reshape the promotion's initial plan because winners without local ties change the story the UFC can sell. Practically speaking, the UFC would have to decide whether to lean on Chimaev's global draw for a one-off splash or stick with building a sustainable African market around a local champion. That's why the real stakes of UFC 319 extend well beyond the belt. The outcome will influence not just who headlines the next card, but how the UFC plots its global future and which projects get fast-tracked or put on hold. UFC 319 is both a sporting fight and a business signal. The winner will shape how the UFC sells and times its African debut. The result in Chicago won't just fill the record books, it will feed directly into decisions about which market gets priority next. After the fight, watch the broadcast rights story. The UFC is chasing a global, possibly multi-partner deal worth around $1 billion a year, and those negotiations will influence how quickly Africa comes into play. If you had to bet which city would host UFC Africa first, where would you put it? Leave a comment with your pick.